Bom dia, good morning, bonjour. It is really a pleasure to have you here today. This is our second webinar in a series of 5 in which we will discuss the main themes on the book, the political sociology of public action. On behalf of the National School of Public Administration, ENAP, we will welcome all of you, and we really hope you have a very good time today. The session will be moderated by Professor Hassenteufel, and today we have Professor Philippe Zittoun and Professor Gwenaëlle Perrier to present their chapters on the book. Osmany, would you like to say a few words to our guests? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Regina, for welcoming this second webinar on the political sociology of public action. Thank you for all the staff of the National School of Public Administration here in Brazil for all their support in preparing this cycle of webinars. It is great to count with your collaboration. I would like also to thank Gwenaëlle, Perrier, and Philippe Zittoun for joining us today. And Patrick Hassenteufel, who is my co-author and co-editor of this book. Thank you very much for being here. Also, thank you all of you who are watching in Zoom and on YouTube this webinar. It's a great pleasure to receive you today. So I just wanted to say a few words. This webinar is the cycle of webinars is organized by the National School of Public Administration. The program of graduate studies in public policy and management of the University of São Paulo and the Laboratory of International Public Policies of the Federal University of São Paulo. That I coordinate at that institution. Again, for those who didn't watch the previous webinar, the book of the webinar, the book Political Sociology of Public Action, is available to be downloaded for free at the ENAP library. We're going to include the link here in the YouTube chat for you. And I would also like to invite you for the next webinar that is going to be on the 10th of June about political parties, law, and governance in public action. We're going to have as speakers Anne-Cécile Douillet from the University of Lille, Thierry Delpech from the University of Grenoble, and Renaud Epstein from the University Sciences Po Saint-Germain-en-Laye. This is a cycle of 5 webinars, and this is only the second. You can find all the information of the next webinars on the webpage of the website of the ENAP. Last but not least, I would like to invite you to subscribe and activate the notifications ring bell on our YouTube channel of Labopi in order to receive all the information about the events we are hosting in our channel. And I would also like to inform a technical element of this webinar, as Patrick Hassenteufel is going to be moderating all questions and the full webinar. I would like to kindly ask you to prepare to write your questions to the speakers in English. This way, Professor Patrick will be able to report these questions to the speakers. So with no further delay, I would like to invite Patrick Hassenteufel to start this session. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Regina and Osmany, for the organization of this webinar. So we are a little bit late, but we will have enough time for this second session of our webinar with two presentations today. As Osmany already said, those two presentations concern two chapters from the first part of the book. The third part of the book is focused on usages of sociological approaches in order to study the policy process. So we will start following the order of the chapters. We will start with the presentation of the pragmatist approach by Philippe Zittoun. Philippe Zittoun is professor of political science at the University of Lyon, and he's also the General Secretary of the International Public Policy Association.
Associação de Políticas Públicas Internacional. Será uma apresentação de 40 minutos e depois a palavra será dada a Gwenaëlle Perrier e ela vai apresentar um capítulo sobre os estudos de gênero e a importância
understanding of the policy process. This is the chapter 11 of the book. Gwenaëlle is a professor of political science at the University of Paris North, Sorbonne. So, Philippe, I give you the word. You have a presentation. You can share the presentation. Thank you.
Sound is okay?
Yes.
Okay.
It's perfect. With a very nice picture.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Osmany, to invite me, and I'm happy to be here, and to also thank you to the ENAP teams. I'm really happy to see you again. So let me give you some words about these chapters. We present the approach I try to develop since few years now, what I call the pragmatic approach, to explain you what is the main, where it's come from, and what is the main aspect or the main interest to follow this kind of approach to understand the policy process. Okay, so just to tell you that, to begin, what we can say about the policy process and the policy theory is there is a large domination since 1970 about what we can call a focus on understanding the policy process, specifically coming from US, and with the idea that we can say that most of this approach focus first on two ideas, which is linked. The first one is to consider the stability of public policy, stability which comes from a system, a policy subsystem, a policy stream, depending on the different approach, a policy community. So there is like a system, and which is more or less incrementalist, and a policy change, which is the second part of the same idea, that we try to understand through generally exceptional situation, more or less from outside event, not all the time, But the idea is that, okay, normal situation is that public policy is stable, supported by a main system, the main system probably linked to policy community, to bureaucracy, to whatever. And if we want to understand change, we can also have more or less a kind of determinist and causal model when we can find, by observing something happen just before, what is provoke this change and what explain this change. So in most of the approach we have, it's like I call this a positivist model, which is work very well, but we have not really changed since 30 years, 40 years, because it was all developed in 1980s, 1990s, coming all of them from US, and all this approach, have the same epistemological foundation. I call this positivist foundation, finding a scientific way to understand what can be the causality. What I try to present to you is, first, I just begin by an example. This is coming from a book I just published about an empirical studies I have. This studies is about the shale gas. It's just to give you an example, but I consider it as an enigma that no one of this model can explain. What is it? It's just to tell you that in very 1 minute, because I don't have time to enter to this empirical case I work on. Okay, it's a first idea. It's very classical in the sense that we have what we call an agenda setting process where a problem arrives because there is a big mobilization against shale gas, and this mobilization provoke a mediatic agenda setting, and this mediatic agenda setting provoke a policy change with a reaction of the government. So the first idea is that classical model can help us to explain this. But what is interesting in this case is that the government have developed not one, but 4 solutions, which is totally different, and some of them opposed. What is interesting in this case, and I don't present this case today, but it's just to tell you that how this kind of case is an enigma, because in most of the causal and positivist model, the same condition, the same situation, the same context, which is the case of the French case, and can explain one case, but not 4 solutions in the same times. Probably one of the main reasons is that they don't take into account some important consideration of the policy process that I would like to integrate in the what I call pragmatist approach. So just to tell you what kind of aspect that most of the model negligate, the first one is the importance of uncertainty during the process itself. So there is uncertainty before the process in the agenda problem, but the process itself in the determinist approach is more or less provoked by the condition before. So uncertainty inside means that it's not previsible what's happened, predictable what's happened during the process, because there is so many complexity in the process itself that uncertainty is also come from what's happened inside the process. The second thing is this idea of system is really problematic, of policy subsystem, of whatever, because when you observe a process, and it's something that we can say that there is a long French tradition coming from the sociology of organization, who sees the bureaucracy as a multiple situation of conflict. And the idea that we can have like a subsystem is probably not so true when you observe concretely, for example, all the conflict inside administrative staff, inside between different offices, between different departments. And all the model of policy process not really integrate the complexity of bureaucracy, but in the French tradition, to come back on this, we have integrated. But the compatibility between the two, the policy model framework and this diversity of situation, which means that it's not one subsystem, but a multiple situation is not really taking into account. The third point is probably the reflexive capacity of actors. More or less, there is a lot of importance on this reflexivity when we examine the problem. For example, the focus on the definition of the problem, how the actors define what is a problem is really important in the policy process literature. But when we observe all about instrument, solution, public policy, there is the same equivalence of attention about the reflexivity of how the actors define what is an alternative, how there is a collective definition, and what kind of reflexivity they have about how it governs. A fourth point is probably that in a lot of policy process framework, coalition already exists because, for example, people have the same, share the same value, share the same interest. But what we observe in a lot of time in policy process is that the position of the actor is not stable, and the alliance, the coalition can change depending on the statement, the solution which is proposed, or the problem which is defined. The 5th point, which is also linked to the first point, is because the conflict is very central in policy process, so we see some of the very few models who try to integrate this conflictual dimension, but because the conflictual is interesting also when the result of the conflict is undetermined. So this is something generally which is not enough taken into account. 6, it's something also coming from probably this point coming more from French tradition about the importance of meaning. There is some tradition who have the idea that there is an importance of ID, but I make a big difference between ID and meaning, and probably I will come back on this. And last, which is more or less true in a lot of aspects, but we have difficulty to be integrated in the specificity of the approach. No, everyone is agree about this, but how to manage this is a powerful dimension and the political dimension, which is central in policy process to understand specifically what I call the ownership conflict. So what is, so all this dimension is not really enough taking into account some of them by most of the classical, what I call positivist approach, which dominate a large part of the field, but we have probably a lot of difficulty to renew. So what I call, where is this pragmatist approach come from, and how we can import this or develop this in the policy process. So I have not a lot of time, so I just give you 1 or 2 focus. This is a large list of heritage. So when you don't want to be only from one heritage, you can see there is a lot. In this case, it's clear that there is a first heritage from the pragmatist philosophy, coming from Dewey and James. It's interesting to observe that the first people who have worked on policy process, what we call the Chicago School of Political Science, coming from this, are really influenced by this. And there is a wonderful book from William Dunn, published last year, who evoke the complex link between this pragmatist tradition coming from the philosophy in the beginning of the 20th century and the beginning of the policy process. When we call this, we need to work not on the state, but on the state on action. It's kind of pragmatist aspect, which is observing not concept, not as just something which is an ontological way, but also in action to understand how people define it, live it, whatever. I don't develop the other tradition, but I can say that what of my work was probably to merge in French tradition what we call the cognitive approach, which was really influenced me for sure, specifically with Bruno Jobert, and probably that some of presentation have evoked, but also other tradition coming from the international level, specifically what we call the argumentative term from Fisher, but the linguistic term in social science, and for sure, all about the constructivist approach. So just to evoke this tradition, what is interesting in this long tradition coming and was coming back since 20 years in France, but also in US, specifically in sociology, is the idea that all phenomena must be observed by considering what we call the unexpected consequences during the process, during the experiment. So the main idea is that social phenomena is never repeat itself, even if the condition seems more or less the same, because inside the process, there is all the time unexpected effect. So the second point, which is important, I just evoke quickly, is the idea that all concepts must be observed, not with the idea that the researcher try to define it himself or herself with like a look for the essence of the concept, but try to understand what role the definition of the concept play in the policy process itself. It's something very classical about problem, generally largely used in all the literature, even in positivist approach, which is one of the important, interesting things. But most of the time during the what we call the policy formulation, it's generally not really taken into account. It's a non-determinist approach, and I don't develop all the point to try to respect the time. I also just want to evoke really quickly the French tradition. So there is Boltanski, there is Chateau Renaud, there is Cephai, there is so many people who work in sociology to try to find a new way in sociology, little far away of the Bourdieu's tradition, but also from other tradition, Durkheimian tradition, find a new way by focus first more on the micro observation. And it's something that most of the policy process studies don't really take into account. How to observe really concretely all what happened during the process, the concrete discussion between actors, the concrete definition, but also to go to be really careful about the production of knowledge, the interaction, the building of agreement, and the building of conflict. I also not time to develop. What I want to focus more is what I call 5 main characteristics of this approach that we need to take into account in the policy process. So first one is to consider its principle, but to consider that every actors, every policymakers, every whatever the situation, have always discursive and strategic skills, which mean that we first consider that each of the actors it's more have always a margin of freedom, and this is probably one of the key understanding of the uncertainty of the policy process. People not react has a lot of elements we think that they react. They have also subjective rationality about giving meaning, but they have a real discursive skill to recognize and cognitive skill to recognize the situation, to read it, to explain it, to build their own discourse about the reality. Second point is to consider that through this discursive practice, we need to understand how the actors build together the kind of proposals they develop and the kind of coalitions they are. It's probably one of the main differences with different approach who consider, for example, that coalition exists around interest, around belief or whatever. It's all the time to observe how there is like a co-construction between what the people defend together and what I see the time goes very fast, so I accelerate. 3, it's to consider that collective action is a problem, so I evoke this. 4 is also to make a lot of attention on the critical part of the process itself. I like one of the chapter of Mayon in his book about argument in the policy process insists a lot about the feasibility argument, how this kind of argument play as a very important role to understand the powerful of some situation and some experts. So this is the kind of thing we need to observe. In the pragmatist approach, the main idea is also to be careful about, to be a real importance of the fighting when people develop himself and his critics in the same time. There is a lack of ownership conflict. Last consideration, I just want to evoke quickly, but probably we can. Is it okay? I lose the sound. Okay. Last consideration is to take into account a world of the policy process largely more complex than the idea of subsystem, with a lot of space of debate. Why we autonomize a lot of space of debate? First, because we observe more in terms of micro observation. And the space of debate is first an empirical situation when people discuss, debate about definition of problem, of solution, and whatever. And the second aspect is also to consider that in each space of debate, there is their own rules. This is one of the problems with the policy subsystem or policy system, because we try to find a general dynamic or mechanism of this system. But probably what I try to develop is there is some mechanism, but this mechanism is probably at under level. What I mean by this mechanism, it's all the situation when in a space of debate, the situation is not the same exactly. So I try to explain. In the situation of, there is some situation of the space of debate where there is a monopoly of situation with some actors, with some expertise, very classical. But in the same times, we will find a lot of arena around. And this capacity to think together all these different situations is very important to understand the policy process. I will explain just after. How much time I have? Not a lot. Okay, so 5 dimensions. So after the 5 characteristics, the 5 dimensions of the policy process. What is important when we use this kind of framework and from this approach is always observing the discursive practice to build problem, which is very classical, but also to build what I call solution statement or alternative statement. How the actors build a solution. You know that there is one of the most important enigma in launched by Cohen Marchesson, but also by Kingdom. It's the idea that the solution is of its own dynamic. So what's happened during, but a solution is a solution if they find a problem. And there is like a paradox. And we find this paradox in 2 traditions. There is what we call the tradition about problem framework, with the idea that when you define a problem, you define also a solution. And the more Kingdom tradition was the idea that solution is alone, have its own dynamic, and there is like a coupling system. What we try to do is to more observe exactly what's happened, to come back also in the more empirical observation and micro observation, who have built this solution and how they have tried to build collectively the link between problem and solution. And this is an important point, is observing this discursive practice without give any meaning by ourselves to the solution. Second point, observing the construction of the coalition. there is no, what is interesting, it's what we observe in the different situations is to consider that when there is one actors or two actors or three actors who develop his own alternative, how you come from this situation to a situation where there is a lot of actors who defend the same alternative. And it's a little like a virus in the sense that it's not just like this, it's just not an idea that everyone one morning wake up and say, oh, we have the same idea. But we observe a lot of processes to build this collective action, which means that some actors who try to defend their own definition of the problem or of the alternative to others and to enroll them. And the processes of enrollment is central to understand the dynamic of the policy process. Third, how this coalition fight in the different space of debate. The main idea is that there is different space of fighting in different places in the same time. It's not only one, like we have in the idea of system. So it means that sometimes some actors is in difficulty in some space of debate and can move or circulate their situation to unlock some situation of problem. I will give you an example just after. 4, we need to understand what exactly characterizes this kind of space of debate, which is more micro, what I evoke. I identify 3 kinds of type of debate, which is some of the 2 of the title was developed, the concept was developed by Bruno Latour, but I not use the same definition. The first one is to consider all the different space who have a public dimension. So why? Because first, this kind of space is generally largely more conflictual. It's more open, but not completely. And it's not, people not, there is a famous distinction developed by Perelman between conviction and persuasion. A conviction process is when the public, the audience is very large and there is no direct exchange to build a common agreement. So this kind of situation is very important. It's a space, you have the media space, but it's not alone. And you have different space. The second, the 2 other space is what I call the hidden space. So it's not in the public visibility, but what I observe is 2 kinds of space, even if there is probably some continuum between different situations. The first one I call this a Polycyatrium. What is a Polycyatrium? Is a kind of little space where a group of actors, okay, it's low conflictual and dominate with a regime of debate, and it's a very asymmetric space of debate. At the opposite, the policy arena is a space of conflict where there is no one group to dominate clearly. And what is interesting, because this kind of space is not at a big level, but at really little level, is this kind of space you can find at different level. In the same bureaucracy, you can have some atrium and some arena, and some situation you can move, but also in other outside bureaucracy. So, last point is to consider that to really understand the policy process, we need to follow exactly the condition of success and failure of the trajectory of the problem and of the solution. And it means that we need to observe step by step in the interaction of the different actors, who discuss of what, at what moment, and what was the transformation first of the statement to win, because from the beginning to the end, there is a lot of transformation, and also the condition of some solution who disappears. There is no, each solution is absolutely linked to a powerful situation and to ownership conflict. So the main idea of the following situation is really to understand the policy process in a different way. So just to give you an example to better understand, I come back to my first enigma, even if just to give you an idea. What is interesting in the situation is that each solution have its own place of emergence, have own circulation, and an own condition of success or failure. For example, my first solution was clearly invented in one office of the bureaucracy, which is the office, which is the expert of shale gas, to answer to a problem agenda. The second and first solution was developed in another place, which is the director of the department, which is more an arena than an atrium. The last solution was built between the member of parliament. So three different places where the actors have built and defined their solution to solve the same problem. Second, each solution have, with its owner, have developed a strategy to enroll new actors to become more important. If I come back to my first solution, they try to enroll, coming from this office, they enroll the director, the sub-director, the deputy director, the cabinet, and the minister. And they arrive to build this, to consolidate this solution. The second and the third solution was developed by the department, the director of the department. They tried to enroll at this time some company, industrial company with them, but also the prime minister, the minister, the president, the cabinet. And the last solution also have his own trajectory of enrollment. And each solution was contested. The first solution was contested when the ministry use this solution, was dominate in this atrium, in the public space. The rule of the public space is not the same. The experts have not the power in this public space, and this solution disappear, be so criticized in 3 days that it disappears. The second and first solution, you can't understand this without the idea that the director of department first tried to build a new kind, to change the data and the configuration of actors about the solution. And you can't understand this without integrate the conflictual dimension, which is central between the Ministry of Industry and the Ministry of Ecology. And the last one, you can't understand this without the tension between the administration, the member of parliament, the government. So I don't develop this, but it's just to give you this idea that each solution reflects, by its success and by its failure, a new kind of ownership and power through the policy process. And this is what is interesting me. To finish and to conclude. So the main idea of the pragmatist approach is clearly to observe the meaning struggle, the meaning conflict, linked to the meaning ownership and the meaning power in the same time. So it's to consider policy process as nothing else than a political process where there is winner and loser each time, where they replay the legitimacy of government and they play a try of new configuration of actors and power. I also tried to combine what I call the three dimensions, the game of language, also the actors to define what they want to defend, the game of actors, they try to build agreement around, and the game of power, they try to impose through the meaning battle and the meaning struggle their own solution on the process. Understanding the policy process as a political activity is the key element it's not to find the real key of how a policy, about policy process itself, but to understand how a policy process helps us to better understand the process of legitimacy and criticize of the government. And I think I finished, yes.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for this really stimulating presentation. You can find it, of course, developed in the chapter 6 of the book. And Philippe mentioned very recent research he made on shale gas, and the published was very recently published in France, in French.
And soon in English.
Soon in English, great. So I give the word now to Gwenaëlle on a rather different approach, the gender study approach, and how it can be integrated to policy studies. Gwenaëlle, the floor is yours.
Okay, I just, can you maybe put my plane, or should I do this? Wait a minute, partager l'écran, option partager. I just want to put my plane and it doesn't work. Partager l'écran, voilà. Et j'ouvre ça. No problem. Can you see my presentation, or okay? Is it okay? Can you see my presentation? Arrêtez de partager. Or maybe. Okay, I will do without because it's a bit. I have not my second laptop and it's too complicated. Okay, I will make without. So, first of all, many thanks to Osmany and Patrick for organizing this webinar, and thank you to the ENAP team. I'm very pleased to speak in it. I will make a presentation about the research field gender and public policy analysis. First of all, and very quickly, how can we define gender and what are the bases of gender studies? Gender is defined as a social relationship based on sex inequalities. Sex inequalities concern all spheres of personal and public life. They concern family, for example, where there is an unequal distribution of domestic and care work and where specific educational standards exist for boys and for girls. Sex inequalities concern also the labor market, where there is especially an overrepresentation of women in low-paid jobs. These inequalities concern politics, with an underrepresentation of women in the political parties and in the highest position of power. And sex inequalities concerns also sexuality in couples' life, as women are the most numerous victims of rape and as the authors of domestic violence are almost always men. I won't enumerate all of them, but I just wanted to evoke this briefly. Gender norms and gender inequalities not only concern the inequalities between men and women, but also concern inequalities inside the women's group and inside the men's group, for instance, between heterosexual and homosexual men, or between poor and rich women and poor and rich men. Gender studies both postulate and show that masculinities and femininities and gender relationships don't derive from biological differences. On the contrary, gender studies show and postulate that these inequalities are socially constructed. And gender studies insist on the fact that these inequalities fuel power relationships. So to come closer to the themes gender and policy analysis, gender studies have long not been interested in studying public policies. They have rather focused on the analysis of inequalities due to the labor market or to the family functioning. But things have changed since the beginning of the 2000s in France and in other countries. When focusing on the research field gender and policy analysis, we can first of all analyze how public policies contribute to constructing gender roles and gender relations. And it's also interesting to examine how a gender lens can contribute to a new analytical perspective to understand how policies are made. And I will follow these two paths today. So my presentation will be divided in three parts. I'm coming now to the first part. The first part deals with the context in which research about gender and policy analysis has developed in France. Research on gender and policy analysis is quite new in France, as I said in the introduction, for several reasons. On the one hand, feminist policy research has long considered that state was a patriarchal institution, so that feminist policy research has first focused on the analysis of the labor market. On the other hand, policy analysis, which needed a certain time to become fully legitimate in the French political science, has focused on virile topics for many years. Gender became in France a legitimate research topic in the field of policy analysis in the 2000s, as said in the introduction. What factors have contributed to the development of research on gender and policy analysis? First of all, gender was legitimated by international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, or the European Union. One of the most well-known conferences on this topic was the Beijing Conference in 1995. A renewal of feminist and LGBTQI movements contributed also to the legitimization of the subject. So, under the double pressure of international organizations and of social movements, France, like other European states, promoted more and more equality policies. For instance, equal opportunity policies on the labor market, quotas in the field of political representation, violence against women policies, or work-life balance policies. All these policies were particularly promoted from the 2000s. All these policies became new and exciting research topics for researchers, and most of the time for female researchers. Last but not least, changes within the academic field contributed to the growing number of work on gender and policy analysis. First of all, more and more women have decided to work in the field of political science. In political science congresses, workshops have been dedicated to gender and policy analysis. And last but not least, a few political scientists with great legitimacy, such as Pierre Muller, decided to supervise PhD students working on gender policies. Thus, since the beginning of the 2010s, many PhD students have conducted their research in gender and public policies. Some researchers have also specialized in this research field. Before I come to my second part, I want to add something. It's important to have in mind that I wrote the chapter of this book in the summer 2019. Making my presentation of this chapter today in 2021, I have to underline that gender studies have been attacked for several months by conservative groups and persons in France. Among them, especially research that mobilize the intersectionality approach is criticized. Intersectionality approach analyzes how gender relations are connected with other social relations, like relations related to the social class, to the race, to the sexual orientation, to the age, or to the handicap. And even if I can't develop this point, I think it's important to underline that the legitimacy of this research field is still disputed in France too, and not only in Brazil. So I hope this few and quickly exposed element of analysis can help you to analyze the situation in Brazil. And now I come to my second part. In the second part, I want to show that gender policies constitute new research themes and raise new questions for policy analysis. An important part of research about gender and policy analysis concentrates on gender policies. Be careful, according to the definition of gender policies given by Isabelle Engeli, Pierre Muller, and Tan-Nguyen Balmer-Kao, gender policies aim at acting on gender relations, but not necessarily in an equality perspective. So to put it with other words, gender policies are not always gender equality policies. This being said, I want to focus on two main points in this second part. The first point I think it's important to underline is that the institutionalization of gender equality policies is an ambivalent process. From the 90s, a new research field called comparative state feminism has emerged in France and in several other countries. The American researchers, Dorothy McBride-Stetson and Amy Mazur, who played a great role in promoting this research field, have shown that from the 70s in France and in other Occidental countries, states have begun to promote gender equality. In these countries, feminism has been institutionalized, becoming a policy sector with its dedicated institution, actors, norms, and goals. Today, this policy sector can also be called institutional feminism because it doesn't only exist at the national level, but also at the supranational and at the local level. What can we say about state feminism? First of all, of course, government did not begin to be interested in regulating gender roles in the 70s. Legislations concerning the gender relationships are old. For instance, legislation concerning the marriage and the divorce have existed for a long time, as well as legislation about the female workers. But the emergence of state feminism is an important rupture because historically, states have not generally been actors that have promoted gender equality. The opposite is truer. Research on state and institutional feminism has analyzed how state feminism and institutional feminism have dealt with the promotion of women's rights. This research has studied the state's institutions in charge of it, its relations with feminist movements, with the government's bureaucracy, etc., etc. It has produced many results, and I can't expose all of them. I will just expose 2 points that are related to the nature of this institutionalization process of equality policies. First of all, research has shown that in this new policy field, actors generally have atypical trajectories. On the contrary to many other policy sectors and to older policy sectors, the professionals have long not belonged to the administrative elite. On the contrary, they have for a long time come from the feminist movement. These links to the social movement, to the feminist movements, has procured benefits like a great expertise, but can also be a drawback because it contributes to a certain marginalization inside the state bureaucracy. Research has also showed that even if this bureaucracy does exist, it has limited resources and thus remains fragile. Another feature or characteristic of this institutionalization process concerns the ambivalent discourse that can be used by the French state to legitimize its equality policies. State feminism is historically linked to feminist movements, and thus it puts forward the equality norm. But the legitimization of institutional feminism is also often based on utilitarian discourses, showing that the legitimacy of the equality norm remains fragile. For instance, the use of gender quotas in the field of political representation was often justified in France by the fact that women were supposed to be closer to the citizens and that they would restore the confidence in the political institutions. Second example, when the European Union promoted a work-life balance policy, notably for women, this policy aimed first of all at raising the employment rate of European states by facilitating the access to jobs for women. The rise of their employment rate was conceived as a way to improve the financing of social rights. And this work-life balance policy did in fact primarily aim at promoting gender equality at work and at home. Thus, even if state feminism and institutional feminism have become a policy sector with dedicated institutions and dedicated professionals, the links of this sector with the equality goal must still be examined. Analyzing the actors' coalitions involved in the promotion of state feminism and the discourses they have to justify state feminism helps to understand the ambivalence of states' action in the field of state feminism. So to conclude with this first point of my second part, I would say that research on state and institutional feminism is important for two reasons. First, because it helps to identify the ambiguity of state intervention in the field of equality. Secondly, because it also shows how ambiguous the institutionalization of a new policy field can be. I'm now coming to the second point of my second part, called Gender Policies are Private Policies or Policies of Intimacy. Why can gender policies often be called policies of intimacy or private policies? Gender inequalities are constructed in particular within the family and the couple, as I said in the introduction. That's what feminist movements have showed, especially from the 70s, when they claimed the private is political. With this slogan, these movements wanted to show that the oppression of women doesn't only come from the power relationships existing at work or from the power of the state or of the church. Feminist movements have highlighted the fact that the oppression of women also comes from the family itself. Feminist movements have highlighted the fact that the family and the couple can be oppressive because the power of fathers and of husbands is exercised within it. Researchers interested in gender and public policies have studied the publicization process of so-called private issues such as sexual or domestic violence. They have examined how a question that was considered as private became a public issue. The role of feminist movement in this process of publicization of so-called private questions have been highlighted in various research works. It was done, for instance, by Pauline Delage in her research on the emergence and publicization of the domestic violence problem in France and in the USA. Second example, Laurie Boussaguet conducted a research on the emergence of the public policy combating child abuses in France, Great Britain, and Belgium. Third quick example, Bibia Pavard conducted a research related to the recognition of the abortion right. In my chapter, I developed more these examples. Other research have showed the role of gay and lesbian movements in the agenda setting of private issues, such as same-sex unions. That's, for example, what David Paternotte did. Of course, feminist and gay and lesbian movements have had to find support outside and within the institutions of state feminism to promote policies of intimacy. The role of international networks has, for instance, been examined by David Paternotte. And the importance of personal trajectories of feminist activists has also been examined to explain the links existing between feminist movement and feminist bureaucrats. Last but not least, even if policies of the private sphere are often put on the agenda by feminist movement, it is not always the case. Policies of the private sphere are not always equality policies. For instance, the goals of the abortion policy in the former Soviet Union have evolved. They have depended on the role that was devoted to women by the political regime. Women were first considered above all as mothers, on which the future of the nation depended. Then women were more considered as free women who embodied the modernity of the political regime. Another example that shows that policies of the private sphere are not always equality policies is the example I have already exposed concerning the work-life balance policy of the European Union. The work-life balance policies, which intervenes in the family sphere, first aims at raising the employment rates of women in order to improve the financing of social rights. So, as a conclusion of this development dedicated to the policies of privacy, the research on these policies highlights the shifting nature of the boundaries of public policies and shows that the centrality of the boundary between the private and public sphere, which is constitutive of all contemporary Western democracies, can be challenged by the state itself under the influence of collective mobilizations. I'm now coming to the third part of my intervention, where I will show that gender can be a useful analytical category and a useful explanatory variable to analyze other public policies than gender policies. What I want to show in this part is that gender is not only a new object for public policy analysis. As said in the introduction, gender is a social relationship that is present in all spheres of life, in polity, in economy, culture, in education. Gender is also present in all institutions, in families, at school, at work. And public policies are part of society. That's why research has made the hypothesis that gender is necessarily part of them. What does this hypothesis mean? It means that it is interesting to examine the norms promoted in public action with a gender lens. This hypothesis also means that it is interesting to examine the relationships between actors making public policies with a gender lens. That's why I'm going to show. I will do this in 2 points. So my first point concerns gender as a useful category to identify the bias at stake in public policies. In public policy analysis, gender can be mobilized as an analytical category. This has been highlighted in the social policy research from the 90s, by Nordic and Anglo-Saxon female researchers. Researchers such as Jen Lewis has shown that social policies are not neutral filters of gender roles. On the contrary, social policies have promoted and accentuated the male breadwinner model that existed in the European societies. What is the so-called male breadwinner model? This model stabilizes the separation between two spheres, the public sphere, characteristic of male productive work, and the domestic sphere, in which women are assigned to carry out the reproductive work. In most European states, women who were partly excluded from the labor market in the 19th and 20th centuries were first given social rights as wives when social policies were developed all along the 19th and the 20th centuries. These policies which gave women rights as wives accentuated the dependence of women on men, because women did not become their own social rights at first. That's an important result. Research has also shown that this male breadwinner model is not prevalent in the different states. Helga Hernes even speaks of women-friendly welfare states when she defines the Nordic model. As a matter of fact, in Scandinavian countries, the development of public nurseries has doubly benefited to women. Firstly, because many mothers have been able to access to a job thanks to these public nurseries, because they did not have to care for their children all day long. Accessing to paid job, mothers have become more independent. Secondly, the development of the public nurseries sectors has given job opportunities to many women in Scandinavia and also enabled them to become more independent. Lastly, in these countries, social rights are individualized and not given to families. They are given to persons. Thanks to this system, women can have their own social rights even when they don't have a job. The access to social rights doesn't depend on the access to the labor market. This system better promotes gender equality. Now I'm coming to my second point. I want to show that gender can also be a useful category to analyze the disruptive logics of implementation. The first point of my third part concerns the norms, the normative dimension of public policies. More recently, other research, also interested in gender and public action, had studied how public policies contribute to the consolidation of gender norms. As even said, until recently, research centered on gender and public action was focused on its normative orientations. But implementation research had been quite neglected for a long time in the analysis of public action. Nowadays, implementation research is at the heart of various works that adopt a gender perspective. What does this research centered on implementation show? Firstly, this research shows that the representation and practices of street-level bureaucrats, and more broadly of professionals who participate in the implementation of public policies, also tend to create gender effects. And that is an important point. To say it with other words, not only the representation of elites must be taken into account, but also the representations of street-level bureaucrats. And that's what I've showed in my research about the implementation of employment policies in France and Germany in the last 2 decades. I showed that despite the fact that the equality goal has been legitimized by the institution of the employment sector in both countries, professionals who support job seekers rarely care for the gender dimensions of their life and rarely actively promote gender equality in their job. For instance, women continue to be oriented in sectors where part-time and low-paid jobs are numerous. Young mothers have often no access to a professional help because several street-level bureaucrats consider that they have no chance to find a job with young children at home. So, even if institutions of the employment sectors have integrated in their normative orientations the goal of gender equality, training sessions remain rare, so that most of street-level bureaucrats don't know the gender dimensions of the labor market and don't know how to handle with this goal, even if some of them are willing to. Since the beginning of the 2010s, research on gender and implementation of public action has developed in France as part of the ethnographic turn of the discipline in France. Thanks to this ethnographic turn, the impact of gendered representation, or to say it with other words, of stereotyped representations, have been put in light. Arthur Voitou, for instance, working on criminal justice for minors, shows how these stereotypes contribute to explain why girls have fewer sentences and less severe sentences than boys. How does Arthur Voitou explain this? He highlights the fact that to interpret the trajectories of young delinquents, the professionals mobilize elements that are more focused on the public sphere for boys, for example, elements that are focused on social relations, on social difficulties, and on schooling for boys, whereas the elements that they mobilize for girls are more focused on intimacy and on psychological difficulties. Thus, the girls appear more as people in difficulty who need to be protected, and the boy as deviants who need to be reframed or who need to be punished. Ethnographic research, which enables to observe the working conditions of street-level bureaucrats, has also shown that gender effects that exist in the implementation of public policies are not only due to the representation of street-level bureaucrats, they also come from their working conditions. This is shown by Océane Perona, who analyzes the policy to combat violence against women. She has made a 10-month investigation within a judicial police department dedicated to criminal offenses and has created a database of rape proceedings. Despite a legislative framework sanctioning marital rape, she shows that police work tends to devalue these offenses. Indeed, the investigations carried out in case of marital rape are far removed from the elements that are generally valued by police work. Elements that are generally valued by police works are long-term investigations, cases against X, or searches for material evidence. As a consequence, investigation carried out in case of marital rape often result in the case being dismissed, These cases are considered to be of little interest by the police, who also find it difficult to prove that the victims did not consent. As a conclusion of my first part, I would say that work that mobilizes gender as a category for analyzing public policies enriches the analysis of these policies for two reasons. On the one hand, in France, cognitive approaches to public action have historically focused on the decision-making sequence and on the actors involved in the decision. Cognitive approach in France have privileged the analysis of the discourses and values of public policy elites. The above-mentioned works highlight the interest in mobilizing cognitive approaches in the analysis of their implementation. They emphasize how the normative and cognitive representation of street-level bureaucrats influence the fate of public policies. Thus, they illustrate the fact that this constitutes a phase of disruption, to say it with the words of Jean-Gustave Padiolo. From this work, we can also see the contribution of a sociological analysis of public action that is attentive to the concrete work of its actors, to the constraints, to the norms and professional identities that ultimately count for a lot in the future of public action. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm waiting for your questions.
Thank you, Gwenaëlle, for your presentation, for this very substantive presentation. I didn't see questions. So yeah, there are no written questions, but you can. I think that you can also ask questions directly if you have some. But we don't see. There are some phrases in Portuguese, but I don't have the impression that they correspond to questions. So maybe if I make a link with the discussions we had last time for the first webinar, there were several questions on the use of the approach which are presented to the Brazilian context. I know that you are both no specialist of Brazil, but maybe if you could make some links to at least other contexts, like the French context, even if Gwenaëlle, in your presentation, you mentioned also other European cases, but so if you can maybe give some arguments or some ideas to how to use the approaches you presented in the Brazilian context, even if you're not, of course, specialist of Brazil. I don't know if Philippe, you want to start, maybe if you.
So what I present as an approach is not necessarily linked to the country context. I have made, when I was in Brasilia last time, I was with some civil servant and training civil servant, and we have a lot of discussion about policy making in Brazil. And also probably the difficulties they have to understand the political dimension of the policy making, the tension inside bureaucracy, and between bureaucracy and the political level was very interesting. And here, so the first goal of this approach is to propose to have a kind of agnostic view about what's happened exactly. What's happened in the policy process to allow some policy change and not. And in the case of Brazil, what I understand from them, it's all the tension between the political system and a bureaucracy which is not necessarily in the same perspective, and how in all this tension provoked a multiple way of policy process and the instability of the system. And this was very interesting because what allow, in my view, this kind of approach is really to take into account because we observe more micro the level of all the level of the discussion of the different policy process, specifically when there is conflict and tension inside the discrete space. So what I observed in the discussion was very useful for them to understand, in one part, the different try of transformation of reform launched by the government, and in other part, all the tension and the way of kind of resistance and not in the policy-making process, and how also there is some entrepreneur who arrive to find a third way, using probably this tension as an opportunity in their career. So it was very interesting in this experience. And probably again, this importance of understanding that the political dimension of the policy process is in the center of the analysis of the policy process in the pragmatic approach, observing this meaning conflict, this argue conflict. For example, the importance for some experts to use the feasibility argument against some different policy where they are not really necessarily agree was, I think, so my impression was really useful for them to develop, to have another view, a different view about what's happened in public policy. So when I was in Brazil, it was just after the election of Bolsonaro, and the situation was really, the discussion was really interesting.
Thank you, Philippe. And during your answer to my question, there was a question in Portuguese. So I'm not completely sure that I understood the question. I try to understand Portuguese with my French, but I have the impression that the question is related to Gwenaëlle's presentation. So you will have two questions. If I understand right, the question is how to combine the gender approach with the advocacy coalition approach, and yes, how it is possible to combine them.
Yes.
And maybe it's also a way to answer to my more general question.
Yes, it's an interesting question. The advocacy coalition approach has been mobilized by different research work. For instance, by Sophie Jacot, who has analyzed the development of the equality policy of the European Union she has showed that the equality policy sector in the European bureaucracy was weak, and that feminist bureaucrats have had to construct coalitions outside and inside the bureaucracy. Outside the bureaucracy, these coalitions, coalitions have been built with feminist organizations, with feminist non-governmental organizations, with women in trade unions. And inside the bureaucracy, they have worked together with, for example, the Employment Service of the European Union. They have also searched partners in the different European institutions, for example, with the Commission for Women's Rights of the European Parliament. But this approach is interesting because on the one hand, it concentrates on the partnerships or alliances that are built by actors, but it also concentrates on the discourses that are developed to justify a new public policy or new policy measures. And Sophie Jacot has shown how a quite utilitarian discourse was developed by the feminist coalition to gain legitimacy. So yes, the advocacy coalition framework is really interesting because the equality norm is not always consensual in bureaucracy and in society in general, so that this sometimes weak legitimacy leads actors to build discourses and to build arguments to legitimize their goals. I have also mobilized the advocacy coalition framework to explain how in the employment sector in France and Germany, equality projects have been pushed forward as feminist actors sometimes are quite often not very numerous. They have to build coalitions with other actors, and these advocacy coalition frameworks has been mobilized to show how feminist organizations, for instance, have coalesced with bureaucrats of the employment sectors that shared their feminist convictions to promote gender equality projects. I think it's interesting to understand that this advocacy coalition approach can be mobilized not only to understand how gender equality policy can be promoted, but also how gender equality policy can be implemented. That's what I did in my research on on employment sector. Yes.
Okay. Now we have several questions coming. Yeah. There are 4 of them addressed to Philippe, so I will take them, and then Gwenaëlle, there was another question for you. Maybe we will finish with that question. So Philippe, there are. I don't know if you had time to read all the.
Yeah, I can read it. So
yes, you can read the 4. There was one. The first one is more methodological. and the role of observation, but I think that you're not only doing, I know that you are not doing, not only doing observation. The second one is the relation to other dominant approaches in the Anglo-Saxon world, because you discussed the advocacy coalition framework, but not that much the multiple stream and neo-institutionalism. The third one is the contribution to the understanding of the neoliberal term. Yes, you have also a third one concerning actors, which can produce consensus between different actors, and like the policy brokers and the advocacy coalition framework, and there was, so that's there are three questions, but I think that there are more now, so I will. Okay, maybe you can answer.
So quickly. So first about the methodology. So I use more interview than observation. Why? Because most of the time, specifically in the policy process, my investigation begins after the decision was taken. So to really understand what's happened, I use this interview, but I also try to access to archive, for example. In the case of shale gas, I use archive of the government when it's accessible. Sometimes it was in this case. During the pandemic, with Patrick, we have an investigation actually on economical crisis and public policy in front of economical crisis. So I will arrive to have some interview. So few of them, some of them in video, Zoom, but it's not so good. But at the end, I arrive to have in the health secure condition, some observation, some interview. So this is the first thing, but so I think it's really important to have this long-term investigation and to interview, in my case, all the level. I mean, in the bureaucracy, but also in Total, or also in the parliament. It's to understand all the different level and all the perspective of actors to arrive to reconstitute, because it's a reconstitution of what's happened. And I think it's a way to understand to answer to the second question. So the US approach, like the Kingdom one. So Cohen March-Olson, I think that even if Kingdom have been largely influenced by Cohen March-Olson, there is big difference between them. But what I think is really important, and it's also work for advocacy coalition framework, is that all this model try first to impose a model to the empirical observation. And I was fascinated by that in the sense that, for example, in the case of shale gas, there is a lot of advocacy coalition framework studies who work on different countries. But in my case, so first is, in my case, for example, I have a lot of actors, the prime minister, the president, who change position, but they don't necessarily change belief or not belief, but they change of alliance. And this kind of situation, when the model doesn't work, and when the team of ACF tried to understand the French situation, they exclude the case. And what I think is, in our way, empirical case is more important than the model we use. And the enigma, what I call the enigma, which means that the situation where the model don't arrive to explain, is central in this perspective. And it's probably one of the main important things. So it's like a falsification in a Popperian way. What is important is not the case who enter in the model, because it's like an auto proof of what you think, just to prove things. But it's more interesting to say, if you consider that, like Kingdom, that, for example, there is a problem stream, which is a public stream, and the policy stream, which is something relatively homogeneous and a discrete stream. What's happened when the policy, for example, go in the mediatic agenda? It's not working, this model. And there is so many things that all these models have a tendency to reduce hardly the reality and make investigation on what is the reality need to be first. So this is something important. About next question. About tournant, liberal tournant. So it's an interesting thing. You know, it's something. It's a continue about this. So maybe if you evoke this, you know the famous book of Bruno Latour. The name is the Tournant néolibéral, the neoliberal term on policy, and it was so Joubert was my supervisor, and I make my PhD at this period on housing policy. And all the main authors, Pierre Bourdieu, who are right on the housing policy, but also Bruno Latour, consider that housing policy is the Troy horse of the new liberal term. But what I observe when I observe and try to understand the housing policy change is not work. Sometimes it's more liberal, sometimes it's not. And even what is liberal was a definitional concept which is in conflict between the different actors and who change their point of view during I observe a 10 years policy process. So, and it's a long discussion I have at this period with my supervisor, because I think that reality is, again, we need to put first this reality. And the ability, for example, we know this ability, the ability of the actor to say what is liberal and what is not. It's, you know, it's little like when you are a researcher and you have a program when you say you need to be to work on innovation, you always arrive to make a bricolage that your project become a project about innovation. And the ability of the actors to adapt the concept, the interest, the belief, and whatever in the situation is something which really interests me. So to answer to your question, I think you need, it's a really important question, but we can also observe the more complexity about what mean some concept that we want to impose to this reality, like the concept of liberal in terms of public policy. And when we work on the economical crisis, or when I work on housing policy, actually, how some people become totally Keynesian suddenly, or not, and even what's mean, how they interpret this, it's really interesting. Probably the debate about what is liberal, what is not, and the symbolic powerful of this concept is more interesting by the concept itself. And probably it's one of the main differences between economists and political scientists who can also observe the powerful dimension about this. How I identify relevant actors in possible So first, one time again, for example, take the concept of coalition. Even if I use it, it's not easy because how you can understand what is a coalition? This is the first problem. It's really useful as a concept, but it's not like a football team where you have all the players in the team and who make the same team. People is not necessarily play all the time together in all the situations. And coalition is also a concept that we impose to the reality. It's not like a governmental coalition where there is a real alliance to govern. But when you observe all the conflict inside bureaucracy, for example, it's really interesting to observe how there is different situation with different combination, depending of what is exactly the topic, what is in the goal, and what time is it, what's the context around. So what I try to do is to reconstitute this career of each proposal and try to observe who was involved in the discussion about this proposal or this alternative. So this is how I identify the relevant actors in the decision-making process, step by step. More arrive to reconstitute what is, for example, like if I give you the example of one of decision, for example, when the Ministry of Environment decide to frozen the shale gas and the license and to launch a mission about high civil servant expert, I try to reconstitute all the discussion there is first between the ministry and its cabinet, and after between cabinet and bureaucracy, and after between the oil company and this, and step by step, who participate to what discussion. And you will surprise. A lot of time I was surprised. For example, we imagine that Total plays an important role, but it's underestimate what is Total and the complexity of Total itself, and the player is not playing the same time, the same moment, the conflict. So this is how I do. And I have another question to answer.
Maybe Philippe, there are several other questions to you, but maybe I will give so you have time to read the question. There is even one in French, so that's easier. But Gwenaëlle, there are two questions for you, and then I will give the final word to Philippe. The first one concerns how do you integrate the resistance to feminist conceptions, and also there is also one in Portuguese, so I'm not sure that I understood everything, but I think it's also the resistance, the opposition to LGBT movement. So how do you integrate the conflicts between feminist groups and anti-feminist groups and political discourse?
Yeah. I have seen the question, how can gender-based public policy be resilient to government programs that are not sympathetic to this issue? Indeed, it's a very topical issue, not only in Brazil, but also in Hungary, in Turkey, in Poland. I'm not sure gender equality policies can really be resilient to government programs that don't want to promote gender equality. I would rather say governments can instrumentalize the gender topic. They can claim, for instance, that they promote women's rights by adopting policy programs that in fact promote a very traditional role for women. What we can say is that it's more difficult for governments to abolish measures that have been adopted by prior governments. I think, for instance, I think that it would be difficult to abolish the same-sex unions marriage for conservative governments nowadays, because this measure have been supported by a quite large part of the population in France, for instance, but also in other countries. But even if they can't abolish progressive measures, they can, I think, instrumentalize the gender topics, as I said, by promoting measures that put women's rights forward, but that have a quite conservative understanding of women's rights or women's role. What is important to say is also that, of course, there is an international context which values the equality norm, because international organizations value gender equality, also because feminist movements are organized beyond the borders and can make pressures on governments. And this context makes it more difficult for countries to cut or to abolish totally women's rights or LGBTQE rights. I think it's interesting to see that in Brazil, for instance, attacks first of all concern the academic world, because gender studies have a critical dimension, and because the Brazilian government uses the rhetoric of the Vatican, of gender theory, and of denaturalization of gender identities. But even if the international context is better or more favorable to women's rights and sexual minorities' rights, I think government have real rooms for maneuver to make women's rights and sexual minorities' rights regress. And the other question was, yes, I haven't read it. Can you say it to me again, Patrick?
I'm sure that there was another question.
The conflict between feminists and...
No, it was only my formulation, which was not very clear, but it was two questions, and I think that you addressed two questions. So there are some more questions to Philippe, mainly the advice you can give to students or to practitioners if they want to use the pragmatist approach. And there was also the question in French on the diffusion to the how do you can integrate to your approach very broad public spaces.
So for the first question, do I identify relevant actors present in possible correlation during agenda setting and decision making to allow cooperation from same solution? Not so much. What I observe, I think it's two political different activity, the question of problem and the question of solution. It's not, in the question of problem, in the definition of problem, there is all the time an important criticize about government and what they have not do yet, which is important in the politicization process to contribute to the problem agenda setting. And it's something really important. At the opposite, people who support solution is generally first need to legitimize government. It's not neutral. The two phase is complementary but not neutral. And I consider this as two opposite political activity. A disordering activity, how you contest, and an ordering one, how you legitimize. And this is why it's not so evident, but sometimes it can arrive. So for example, I come back to Michel Foucault's case, the mobilizations was in the beginning against shale gas. So be against shale gas, it's nothing. And to organize a mobilization, we observe that the main slogan that is in common is no shale gas. It's not solution or not solution. It's different also from frozen license or to vote a law to forbid any fracking in the country. It's not the same formation. When people have to build solution, it's more complex in the sense that you can stay little ambiguous when you have a problem. You create disorder because you are ambiguous. Ambiguity contributes to enlarge your coalition. When you build a solution, when you build a text of law, you need to have some words, precise words. It's not only no to shale gas. You need to say what you need to forbid, for example. And we observe that the coalition is more unstable in this case. So the activity of put problem in agenda and the activity that what I call to domesticate problem is two different activities. It's not mean that sometimes some actors don't change their role, but it's not the same things. And if you are an opponent and just say, I have a solution, you will see the media don't really focus on you. They focus on your capacity to criticize. So this is why it's not so evident, because all the time there is no solution without a political and power dimension. It's not just a solution like a rational solution that everyone can be agree. There is always winner and loser in any policy solution. Second, is CACF useful for observing the construction of discursive coalition around problem and alternative? My answer is no. As you can understand, ACF is, if you know really what is ACF, is really a positivist model. They try to have hypotheses. It's very try to import that like a method coming from physical science with hypotheses, with testing. And at the end, what you observe, policy system, for example, subsystem, it's not correspond. You have coalition A, coalition B. Sorry, but when I observe what happened inside, I have so many actors who not enter in this case, but it's not work like this. And the problem is this, when I discuss with people who work on this, they try at the end to push more their model to the reality, but to use the empirical to understand and the theoretical aspect to understand the reality. Reality becomes second, in my view. This is why I'm not really this, but it's a long controversy. So what are the type of students who want to begin? So this is not for me. And in French question, the question of fighting. No. Okay, so first, about I don't know the Ministry of Environment in Brazil, but I met some civil servant. So you can't speak about Ministry of Environment. It's a complex group of actors with different strategy, which is generally not in the same way. I don't know if they try to hide some information, probably not. I don't know exactly the situation. So, but something is funny, and it's not about Brazil. But you know, in the shale gas case I work on, all the actors was absolutely persuaded that the government have hidden the fact to give license on Total. But when you observe, it was funny because you find easily some article in the newspaper. So it means that sometimes it's more complex, the concept of hidden. And it's also people who don't see as people who hid. But in the case of this, I don't know. But so I come back just 2 minutes about this question of domestication. The role of a government is to solve unsolved problems. So just consider that the government, most of the problem have no really solution. It's too complex to have solution. And all solutions have always create new problem. So what is the main role? It's Wildavsky who say that, and I really in agreement with this. Probably one of the most important role of a government is less to solve a problem, but to redefine a problem that it can be solved. And we observe this in this activity, and this is something important. This is why it's also a discursive activity, the political process, the policy process. It's how a government can explain that you have a solution to a problem. So, and when you have a public declaration in the forum, it's only the end of the process. And what I would like to push people, if you really want to understand what's happened inside the Ministry of Environment, is to really reconstitute the trajectory before what's happened in the public way. Because we can't understand what's happened here before following all this trajectory and the impact on the trajectory. I have a concept that I use, you know, there is a lot of, a big mood about the concept of resilience, but it's a very famous concept. And what is interesting is the concept of, in the resilience, is the concept of resistance. But what I observe is not a concept of resistance. We've come back to the initial statement. Most of the solutions need to be changed to go beyond all the resistance and the critics they observe. But all this change is not reversible. And I call this transilience of the solution. What is interesting in all the process is how a solution at the time A become another solution after a lot of conflict. because you find the trace of the conflict in the solution at the end. A lot of time we say, oh, maybe it's not really coherent, the government position. But when you follow, for example, the 25 version of each article of the law, it's interesting to observe that each word can come and be withdrawn with the different conflict. And the result of the text is not just one brain who are thinking that, it's the result of this process. And I think I finish.
Yes, I think
of the policy practitioner, just maybe this one. It's always difficult for someone who try first to we propose a key to observe and to understand what's happened. What I can say is when you observe all this reality, you can say that first, there is no change without, it's something very obvious. There is no change when there is no actors, even practitioners who have mobilized himself. And second, we observe that there is so many space of fighting, but generally when a situation is blocked, you're really surprised to observe how the ability, and it's maybe something that can use some tip that can use some practitioner, there is always possibility of circulation to change the rule where it's blocked. I don't know if it's clear what I say, but you can see that in another way. There is no situation which is always that you can't change. But how you fight is also important, that where you fight and with who you fight.
Thank you, Philippe. I think that we need to finish because it's already 10 after 5. Thank you very much for all your answers, for all the questions, for this very stimulating debate. And of course, you have more details on the two approaches in the book, because when you read the two chapters in the book. I also want to stress that these two approaches, which are quite different, but they share two things. They are sociological approaches using sociological methods, but also grasping the political dimension of the policy process. So this is why they can be characterized as political sociology approaches of the policy process, and also they show the complexity and uncertainty of public policy, and this is why also in French we use the notion of public action. So on the chat you can see and you can read that the third session of the webinar won't be next week, but in 2 weeks, on June 10th, and with the presentation of 3 chapters. There will be a bit shorter presentation, but also to give enough room to the discussion. And thanks again for the presentation, for the organization, and for all the questions you asked.
Thank you.
So I think that
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.